Yeah, thanks for the introductions. The plan for today, you'll all be aware that JORC's currently undergoing an update. The first consultation stage in the consultation process takes the form of a survey which has been open now for a couple of months and is still open for another week or two for anybody interested to express their views on any aspect of the code and how the code should, how you see the code should be developing. And really pleased to have this opportunity today to get your thoughts on that process. So we'll run today as a bit of a discussion and questions and answer session, and as Peter mentioned, please submit questions using the Q&A function on your screen. We've already had introductions, so to go straight to the code itself, as you're aware, JORC's somewhat unique in that it's a principles-based best practice standard for public reporting of exploration results, mineral resources and ore reserves. It's not prescriptive and in terms of what needs to be in a JORC report, but it's all oriented around principles of transparency and materiality. So the information about a project or deposit or mine or that's relevant to how an investor would value that property or perceive that property, it's important that the report captures that information and presents it in a very clear and material manner. And the quality of information disclosed in public reports is intended to be underpinned by the competence of the persons responsible for that report. And I've emphasised the plural on persons there, and with the ever increasing range of issues that need to be covered in ore reserve reports in particular, where the modifying factors that affect resources now extend well beyond technical considerations related to mining into a range of other issues. I think it's becoming increasingly rare that a JORC report will be the responsibility of an individual. That's possibly a point for discussion today. JORC compliant reports, I guess the most commonly known application of them is that they're required by listed companies reporting to securities exchanges in both Australia and New Zealand, and an increasing number of securities exchanges internationally, if not directly in compliance with JORC, then in compliance with one of the other members of the family of resource and reporting codes now that JORC's a member of. All statutory reports for exploration and mineral production activities now in New Zealand have to be JORC compliant reports prepared by a competent person. And more recently, mining lease applications in Western Australia also need to be supported by a statement of ore reserves, which is prepared in compliance with the code. So we're seeing, I think, a trend for the code to move beyond its original intention of improving public reporting to securities exchanges on projects for consideration by investors. The continuous improvement of the JORC code is the JORC committee's key responsibility. And JORC comprises representatives from 3 parent bodies, which are AIG, the AusIMM, and the Minerals Council of Australia, with input from representatives of the ASX, ASIC, the accounting profession, and legal professions and other allied professions that have are relevant to the industry.
Don't forget the stockbrokers.
And stockbrokers, yeah. I was going to lump them under allied professionals. But, you know, one of the major roles of the committee is ensuring that the code is being applied appropriately, and that end users of that competent persons preparing reports understand the requirements of the code, and that end users of that information also have an understanding of what to expect in the public reports that they're able to access. It's not the JORC Committee's responsibility to enforce compliance with the code. That falls on the parent bodies, but it certainly has a major role in education of both professionals preparing reports and using those reports. You know, I guess we'd all be aware that JORC really was established in response to widespread concern about the quality of reporting on mining projects during the late 1980s, the nickel boom in particular. There was an intensive stakeholder engagement and consultation process at that time that culminated in the first release of the code in February '89, and the release of guidelines to the code in 1990, and then a number of updates to the code as issues have evolved in its application, and the requirements of the code have matured, the most recent of which was in 2012. And so, you know, really, I think each update of the code has ensured that Australia's remained at the forefront of the development of comparable codes in a number of jurisdictions internationally. So, you know, we have something of a, I was going to say a level playing field, but at least a common standard of best practice across a large part of the world. And because of that, competent persons in Australia are able to benefit from reciprocal reporting rights in a number of those jurisdictions, and that's quite important to the practice of a number of us. I think it's fair to say that there were some major improvements in the code in 2012 in terms of transparency and materiality, with the requirement to include information that used to just be discussed in table 1 of the code, and that trend, I think, is continuing, and Steve and Graham can probably speak more to what's driving the latest update, but you know, really, there's a range of needs there to improve the provision of reliable information to investors and securities market participants, transparent description of risks associated with resource projects, and also improvements in standards of competence for professionals preparing JORC reports. So, you know, there's some pretty broad-ranging issues that are going to have an impact on competent persons in particular, and you know, by design, deliver benefits for the end users of the product of the reporting process. So with that, I'll open up the floor and ask Steve and Graham and Mark to comment on any of those points before we get down to the more of a Q&A.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. So last time we went through the code update, you know, through pretty much, you know, 2011 and leading up to the 2012 update. The difference, I think, back then is that there had been a number of issues come up in that previous 4 or 5 years that had ended up with sort of patch jobs onto the ASX listing rules. So we sort of had this a bunch of things that we probably were already on the go list for the new code. This time around, there's less in that sort of space, but I do think I'll just name check a number of issues that you know, will quite clearly come up in the discussions, and I think most of you say they're the pretty obvious ones. Probably at the top of the list, you know, there's a full discussion's got to be had around competence. What is a competent person? How do we, you know, from the soft end of the options of, you know, verifications of experience right through to the hard end, which might end up something like registration. And this is a pretty serious issue for the parent bodies, particularly AIG and AusIMM as the owners of the competent persons. How much is enough? Is it generally okay? But are there small calibrations that can improve it, or is there more substantial work to do? Right now, we don't have that answer. That's a discussion that has to carry on through the part of this year. And if there were to be an agreement that there needed to be higher levels of controls around how competent people were identified, or how their experience levels were in some ways verified, then that's a process that would have to be developed inside the parent bodies. But there's a lot of discussion in the marketplace and amongst users around, I don't think that person or that situation or that stretch is appropriate. And so we're really interesting to see the sort of feedback we get out of the survey around competence.
It's probably worth mentioning there, Steve, that ASIC in particular is particularly interested in that topic. So it's not just what we as an industry think about it. The regulator has a particular focus on this, and we need to get out in front of it and manage that issue, because if we don't do something that they're happy with, they will impose something, and that will be the worst possible outcome.
Competence crosses over too with the thing that Andrew mentioned, which is about the spread of discipline areas that come into a complex mining development, you know, maiden or reserve for the first time. So there is this crossover point around how you can refer to technical experts. I think technical expert sub sign-off, if you want to call it that, coming under the competent person, you know, the mechanisms for that is something we will have to explore, and that will ease some of the pressure coming from groups like ASIC. But in the end, you know, they've absolutely told us that you know, they can't see how someone from a single technical background can actually sign off on all these other things individually. And if there's not a good mechanism to flag who else has been involved in providing that critical data into the assessment, then, you know, that's an area. Anyway, look, do we have an absolute answer on all that now? Do I think it will look exactly the same when we're finished? I don't. We'll have to work through what is an appropriate approach that gives more confidence, but doesn't create a huge burden in its own right. The next one on my list is another favourite topic for many people: reasonable prospects of eventual extraction for resources. We moved partly beyond "it's my opinion and that's good enough" last time with the greater disclosure in Table 1, but it's quite likely that there'll have to be some more transparent support for that view And so there's a lot of discussion. There'll be a lot of feedback in that space too. I'll skip through these pretty quick because I want to leave discussion time. The third one, obvious one, which has changed fundamentally in the last year, is the broader environmental, social, and governmental impacts as a set of modifying factors, and the broader sense of what does development consent look like in today's world, as opposed to what it might have looked like in the old style, more legalistic point of view. There are many, many examples of existing mining leases being changed in different environments, different court processes overlapping mining tenure, consent that was had not being there, and obviously on the other side of that, situations where clearly the wrong things have been done. So it's a hot spot. I can tell you in that area, no, there isn't a common view of what it looks like, and a lot of that is still ahead of us in terms of the broader industry. But there's an area there that there's almost no words in the code around that, what can be the critical path to development consent. The fourth one I wanted to flag, which Andrew also raised, is this really broad issue now of a JORC report being used for non-market reporting, whether it's to support mining lease applications, whether they're going into private equity money raisings, whether they're going through into foreign markets, whether the JORC report is being provided to a market that doesn't ask for any of the additional ASX rules. And so there's a whole sector there. Do we think that's going to stop? Are we ever going to go back to where JORC was probably conceived? No, but there are areas that have caused the committee concern. There are areas in which at the moment the quality of disclosure on what we call the full JORC, the market report in Australia that has to follow the listing rules as well as the JORC code, that level of disclosure might be quite different than what's turning up on a second board in another location. And so, for instance, people are claiming a JORC report, but the table 1 doesn't get published. Now, we see that as a problem. We see that we've got ways to fix that inside the code. But the broader issue about differing views from different state governments and everything else about using the JORC as a technical report de facto is something that we'll have to work on as well. And there's this broader issue, I think, too, more rebalancing the modifying factors. There's quite lightweight discussion on things like metallurgy, which can be absolutely critical path, within the balance of the code. So it's not, it's really about, is there a calibration exercise around the risk weighting of the disclosure? And probably the last one is just the genuine thing about the critical risk disclosure, and is there an opportunity to get something that's quite simple up front as part of the disclosure formats? That is also something that ASIC's come back about. Sort of in the ASIC view, a perfectly documented phone book is not adequate disclosure because all the critical stuff gets lost in the volume. If there are a short list of critical risks, they should be front and center. And that's actually not in any way misaligned to the key principles of the code anyway. But, there's a number of these things. That's a pretty quick run through, but they're sort of like the hot half dozen of sectors of the code that we know we'll have to work hard on. I'm sure there's whole individual bunches of clauses in the code that mightn't change at all, or get the mildest of tweaks. But that's probably the hot list.
You forgot my bugbear,
Oh,
Andrew.
yes, I'll let
Steve.
Graham talk about his bugbear too. Yeah,
It's not just mine. It's
Yeah.
table 1. The way table 1's put together, the way it flows, the way it's meant to work is clearly an area that we need to revisit. whether we revisit it like the latest CRIRSCO template with its multi-strand simultaneous approach, or whether we do something else is obviously an open question. But improving Table 1 is right up there on that list of making the code better for practitioners and probably for people who get around to reading it as well.
Yeah, because I mean the basic stepwise format of Table 1 hasn't changed through that amount of time. So we always get trouble of people that are talking about, putting their a resource update out to the market, and they don't actually go and want to comment on stuff that's in sections 1 or 2 because, oh, that's the exploration phase. Well, guys, if you've collected the information for the first time at this stage, it actually needs to be disclosed. So there's that sort of thing. The one more, while I was thinking of you then, Graham, was this other one about the, what do we do with the I'm different parts of the industry? Historically, we've had a diamonds section in the code. Should that actually be in the code, or should that be guidance that sits beneath the code? In the same way, for instance, brines could end up in that place, because otherwise you end up with a chapter for every single self-identifying different industry, and that turns you into a phone book pretty quick. And so there's none of these things actually change the intent of the code. And probably just before I stop, is the one thing that we're not looking as really up for offer is that the principles basis of the code is up for offer, and the key principles of transparency, and materiality, those things don't change. We're not going to turn into a prescriptive code. We're not going to try and write black letter clauses for everything under the sun, but you're getting balanced disclosure, and particularly risk-balanced disclosure in a readable form. If that was the ethos, that'd be pretty useful. I'll stop there.
I might ask Mark, in your experience now over the last year with presenting the training webinars on JORC for AIG, what are the sort of questions that people attending the webinars are asking or seeing as issues with the code that they're having difficulty with?
Thanks, Andrew. It's been really interesting. We've had well over 200 people attend three sessions of JORC Code training now. There's certainly some commonality in responses to the question about where can the code be improved. And I will make one comment about the principles-based code. And whilst I'm very pleased to have a principles-based code, there is the reality that there are 116 uses of the word must in the JORC Code. So we'll all like to say it's principles-based, but it is becoming more and more mandatory with respect and with more and more prescriptive. And I wouldn't be surprised that at the end of the 2022 code, or whenever it does come out, that number will have increased. So there's the issue of reconciling a principles-based code with the mandatory requirements. That's one of the issues. A second issue is this fundamental concern about Table 1, which Graham has alluded to. The problem that we're often getting is that Table 1, in terms of the prompts that are being specifically asked within Table 1, are totally philosophically different to the whole reason for having the code. So we've got a code which is meant to be there for non-technical people, investors, and yet we're being asked for the technical people to provide very explicit technical information in a lot of those sections of Table 1 that that most non-technical people will really, really struggle, and particularly in Section 3 and 4, where there is a lot of technical information and a lot of prompts which do require technical jargon to be used, and you struggle. So one of the things in the sessions that we talk about is the importance of trying to simplify the content in Table 1 to make it usable for a non-technical reader. As a geologist, I love Table 1. It's a fantastic resource, and I think most technical people do, but that's not the reason Table 1's there. It's not for the technical people. So that's the second area of commonality. A third area of commonality is how to deal with social media. The comment would be that, I've probably seen hundreds and hundreds of LinkedIn posts, and probably not one of them is compliant with the JORC Code. Yeah. So there's an issue of how we deal with social media, and it's not going to go away. The fourth key issue is, and no one's really talked about it yet today, is complaints. We're a self-regulatory, we're trying to do a self-regulatory job. We've had multiple people on the courses who have made complaints, who have said that they've been totally unsatisfied by the complaints process. It's taken too long. It hasn't resulted in any change to the public report that there was a complaint made about, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that if this version of the code does anything, it's got to streamline the complaints process so that it's becoming a little bit more user-friendly and streamlined, so that we can get rid of all the misdemeanors really, really quickly and focus on the key issues. So that's some of the things that I'd like to at least raise, Andrew. Back to you.
Good. Thanks, Mark. A couple of comments on the Q&A. Dave Green and Celeste Crane and Stacey both mentioning now that the Queensland Government require resource and reserve statements to be provided with new coal tenement applications and tenement renewals in Queensland, with Celeste just adding that it's really that the higher level, that's being called on for higher level tenements to provide clearer guidance as to the quality of the resources, and I guess the quality of the work that the applicants for those licenses have undertaken. The one question I've got with the code is that over the last few years, I think we've seen a tendency for companies to be a lot more cautious about what's put into releases, and actually run releases past their legal advisors before they get out into the market. And I'm wondering if that's a function of the way in which the JORC Code and the ASX listing rules in particular have the interactions have become more intertwined, and whether there's a need to step back and sort of look at the structure of an ASX report, whether the report needs to be divided into distinct parts, so that there's a part of that report that deals entirely with compliance of the listing rules, and then there's the more resource and reserve and exploration focused report by competent persons, which would then separate out a block of work which also suits the other applications that the code's being asked to, other areas that the code's being asked to be applied to. Do you have some thoughts on that, Steve and Gray and Mark?
There's an interesting interplay with the oh, wait a minute. Killer phone call.
Is it on cue?
Yeah, as on cue. I've just got to work on the barking dog. There's interesting interplay between where we were prior to the 2012 update. The primary concern at that point in time was that there was just no content being provided in support of quite substantial first release resources and the like. So I suppose the pressure came in, and that's why we ended up with a table 1. I remember the line that we used to talk about there was, you can't peer review a blank page if there's absolutely no detail. Even if the level of the detail is wrong, you've actually got nothing to see except the headline numbers. So we've ended up with the next generation, we ended up with a table 1. Is the current form of table 1 perfect? Certainly not. It's the first sort of update of having to disclose one on step change numbers. Where we ended up last time with the listing rules is that the ASX still wanted to have, and there was some pressure from ASIC in this about these critical summary paragraphs. So if you were claiming a maiden reserve, you couldn't not say anything about metallurgy. There was actually a requirement to say something, at least in a summary paragraph, even if it was still repeated in the full detail in the table 1. So I think the idea of how do you better make hierarchical reporting, but the prescription piece, I think back to what you're saying, Mark, is that you have to, the principle's based, but you can't invoke the principle to say nothing in support of your AMBIT claim. So there is a must sort of base level to provide some supporting information. Can we calibrate that? Can we make it more readable? Can we work through the way, the table is actually organised, and certainly that interface between the JORC requirements and the ASX requirements? I suspect that there's a bunch of discussions about what can be improved in that space too. The basic issue will still remain is we can't sort of go back to no disclosure, but the who's the audience thing that Andrew raised is important there too. Is it presented in an overtly technical form too often, when actually that isn't the primary audience? And so look, I think there's a bunch of things in that space that can get some improvement. How far it gets, we've got to work through that, but they're known issues.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. A question from Dale Sims on the Q&A. What are the timeframes for the review that's it's now underway? And is there a risk that ASIC will run us over rather than wait for us to finish? There's been a comment that the review might take 2 to 3 years in some of the material out around the update, including the advertising for this webinar.
Wow.
Do we really have that long?
No, but not for any other reasons. Our intent was to get a lot of this started up last year. COVID came around, smacked us all behind the ear a bit, and then it forced us to take the start of this into an online remote Zoom world like we are now. The final sign-off level, there are actually some processes that has to go up through to top levels in ASIC and government before final sign-off. But we still intend to have the public engagement run throughout this year, and to have that drafting piece knocked over in a year with 21 at the end of it. We do not want to do this for the next 3 years. I don't think there's anything on the table. ASIC has certainly laid some areas of concern on the table, but there was much more pressure from ASIC last time around than there is this time around. Having said that, the reason I started with competence and this broader issue about an improvement to the current process of self-identification of expertise is, I do believe that we're going to have to all do some work in that space. It's not about trust. It's just, and it does flow into the complaints area that Mark talked about. Someone can identify as a competent person for a commodity, and no one in the world can see their CV, right? And so it's very hard to verify, even in the complaints process. Just does that person have the experience? They don't pre-nominate, there's no record, and there's certainly not the full registration end. I'm not suggesting we'll get to that end, but I just don't perceive a world where nothing changes, where if you self-identify and claim this experience enough to sign off first, that there's no record that you can demonstrate that in a verified CV or whatever. That is absolutely in the territory of the professional bodies, but that is an area I believe that we'll get pressure on, and that does cross over with that earlier discussion around very, very broad expertise. If you're signing as the competent person reserves, then is there a way to bring in the sub-signatories over various other technical experts, which gives confidence again in the market, but also gives the regulators confidence. So there's work to do in that space in particular.
So Steve, what's the most likely result of that? Is it going to be registration, or is it going to be published CVs, or is there something else that's... I
think there's a range, Peter, a range of options from, a competent person, registered, I think is not quite the word I'm searching for, but a searchable CV database where if you're acting in certain areas of expertise that, people can find out about you. One of the common complaints that comes through is that person is not a competent person in that area they're claiming. Then the complaints process has to go and dig up the CV of the person because it's not on record anywhere. And then some of those don't go anywhere and some of them do. If you know your expertise is a matter of public record, there's probably a hesitancy in stretching it too far on your behalf.
Yep.
If you know no one else can see it, maybe after 3 years you can add another commodity in, and that can lead to a complaint. And so, what's not too heavy a process, the full registration following an exam and a whipping by your peers is obviously too far. But what's the thing that would provide more confidence and perhaps discourage people from stretching in areas where they're not up to speed? But this is absolutely a discussion with the parent bodies. Ultimately, this is a triangular discussion, between JORC, AIG and AusIMM, because really the professional bodies own the competent persons.
I was just going to make that point as well, Steve, that it's really a question more for Andrew and Dale and the AusIMM. JORC might say we need to lift the bar, but it's up to the parents to actually articulate what the bar is and how they're going to administer it, and hopefully AusIMM and AIG don't drift too far apart in what they're requiring. Otherwise, we're going to have some very interesting association shopping by CPs.
Oh, that's definitely something, Graham. It's not going to happen. That we've only had very preliminary discussions between AIG and AusIMM to date. It mainly between Janine Herzig and me, and the intent is very much to have a common system for making information about competent persons publicly available. So it'd be AIG and AusIMM both reporting information at the same level, probably on the same platform.
Yeah.
And reaching a common agreement on what competence is.
Yes. Yeah, which is implicit in that. Yeah. Yeah.
There's two elements of that. Is that one of them is the obvious, what is competence, but the other one is where's the transparency in the record keeping. They both work together. So look, I think it's going to be a bit of fun. We spent more than a year doing this last time round. The survey opened up in early December. As of yesterday, where there's about 300 completed responses in there. There's a bunch of part completed, which we think some people go back, and of course it's still open. Some of those individual responses are from companies and represent 20 or 30 professionals, as well as individuals and consulting groups and the like. So that's pretty good. We're going through a process where we're going to see who hasn't responded and actually go and knock on their door in terms of sectors of the industry. So I'm just looking at the Q&A there, the Queensland Government, the RPGeo type thing, the WA Mines Department, give me a JORC resource before you can have the lease, that sort of thing. We know we're going to have to knock on the door of all the various state government agencies, because they're all determining slightly different rules at the moment. They're all going to, that they are not all using their idea of what a JORC report is in the same way.
Let's not forget Geoscience Australia advising politicians based on economically demonstrated resources, which are increasingly at variance with what JORC thinks about a resource and a reserve is, and what's economically demonstrated.
Exactly. So this fair use of JORC by government parties, professional registration groups, and broadly international, those are sort of three elements of that. But that's a big ticket item in its own right. If we don't manage well, the discount JORC will develop in one sector, or the JORC and a half will develop in another sector. And neither of those are good things. That we've all lost control at that point.
Another question on the Q&A from, which has just disappeared off my screen, from Yami about where a project has multiple deposits and the deposits have been described at different times and have resources reported under different versions of the code. How does a competent person deal with that when producing an updated report for the project as a whole?
Probably disappeared because I just jumped in and said no.
Oh.
And in a public report, there is only one JORC code. There is no historical JORC codes. There's only the one that we've got now. So if you're making a public report now, you have to comply with the current JORC code and the current listing rules if it's an ASX thing. So it's been long enough since the code came out that anything that comes out now has to comply with the current code. And if you're doing that new piece of work, then it should comply with our current code. There's a couple of exceptions, obviously, in the ASX sort of space. If there's a continuous disclosure thing, you've done a deal and it's market sensitive, then there's a few quite specific carve outs for historical or foreign resources that can be reported as is. But in general, resources don't sort of just come out of nowhere. You've got enough time to get your act together and do them in compliance with the current rules.
So there's always an opportunity, and what I've tended to do is to advise people to get the thing. If it's a 2004 version of the code, the technical work has been good. You've got access to all the information. You can go and verify the various inputs. You do have the ability to give it an upgrade by doing the appropriate work through desktop verification and then re-sign off. You don't have to re-drill every hole in the damn thing. You don't have to go and, toss out good work because it's older. But, during that process, you'll normally find anything that isn't quite right. And that gives you the focus on what else you have to do too. So, look, if I never hear a JORC 2004 again after we've got a JORC 2021, I'll be a happy man, because it's it's like trying to drive with your grandfather's driving license. It's had its time. It's not going to work anymore. And in fact, if you're trying to inform the market, all it says is you've absolutely done no work at all there for 16 years. Or for whatever, it might be 12, so it'll be 8, 9 years. It's ancient history. But you can upgrade them, and you do good quality verification work, and those same inputs can give you the next version. They rarely don't change at all, but you know, it's a process you can run through, and lots of people do.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. And from Chris Sennett, what do you think ASIC will impose on JORC in terms of resource statements in particular? We got any insight into that yet?
I'll talk a bit, and I'll throw to Graham too. The one thing they were pretty worried about isn't actually the resource world, it's the maiden reserves that go pear-shaped in the first year or year and a half, and you know, the project folds or falls in a hole. So there's much more concern around the veracity for maiden reserves, and that was linked to the discussion around, are some of the competent persons stretching their expertise too thinly? So, you know, there's always stress around early resource releases, but if they're classified as, you know, predominantly inferred, etc., and they change a bit afterwards, that's not quite the same as saying you've got a you know, a solid ore reserve that's got a lot of proved in it that turns into not being a viable mine within a year or two. And so the investor risk is much higher. Graham? Yeah,
look, that's certainly true, Andrew. We have had 2 written responses back from ASIC. Steve wrote to them right back at the very start of this process to say, look, we're going to kick this off, and they came back with one very long 18-page document and then a supplementary one about 4 or 5 pages. I think they basically went around ASIC and asked everyone to write down their favourite whinge about JORC and then send it back to us and compiled it all together. But there were a few themes in the stuff that came back. A lot of it was very coloured by a couple of quite prominent failures in WA gold operations where investors lost quite a bit of money. And that has very much coloured their thinking. They're very focused on the retail investor to the point where they're almost implying that it disadvantages a retail investor if you provide all this complicated technical information, because they can't understand it, but technical people can. So that there's an advantage. You're giving an advantage to people who understand geology compared to punters, which I find a bit problematic to argue against transparency, because just going back to Mark's comment about Table 1 and the technical information, sure, JORC is meant for retail investors, but it's also meant for their technical advisors. And if you can't stand the heat in the kitchen, well, maybe you shouldn't be doing the cooking, or you should be prepared to take the risks on investing in things you don't understand. I don't know how far we have to go as a sector to protect people from their own stupidity. And, you know, transparency to me is still the best way of doing it. Here's all the important stuff that you really need to think about. So look, ASIC are quite concerned about that and how that is presented in public reports. They also, in those responses, were quite leaning towards more independent expert type reporting and prospectus type stuff. They didn't seem to be really thinking as much about your run-of-the-mill ASX announcements of exploration results and mineral resources. It was that expert end of stuff where they have got concerns, and that's about the amount of disclosure. And I guess another theme that we were getting back from them was about competence. They don't like the fact that they seem to get different answers from different competent persons. They want to see greater consistency, greater reliability in the work of competent persons, and that's why they're interested in better identifying who's competent and increasing they've had a few examples where the same report's been same piece of work has been repeated on the same project, and come back with quite different outcomes. And as lawyers, they really struggle to deal with that variability. I think a lot of that variability is real, but the lawyers and the regulators find that problematic to get their heads around at the moment. But you know, to go to Chris's point, I don't know that they're going to impose anything on JORC at the moment. They've told us a series of issues they're concerned about, and they basically said, well, you know, what do you reckon? How are you going to deal with this? So I get the sense that it's a different sort of atmosphere than it was. The last JORC update got rather intense, I think is the right term, isn't it, Steve? We haven't got that at this stage. It's just we've asked for some comments, and ASIC have provided a range of things that they're thinking about. That's part of the mix. That's part why we're doing this survey. It's meant to be a very broad catchment. The survey. We want to know what everybody thinks about different bits of it. What can be improved? What's not working? What can come out? What needs to go in? So it's going to be pretty ambitious to wrap it up in 2021, much as I like that to happen. But there's quite a lot to be considered in this. And I think there will be some, I would hope that there's going to be some good changes in JORC, and it will continue to be the example of the best way to report this sort of stuff in the public domain. I don't think we want to go down the crazy path that the Americans have imposed on themselves with SK 1300, which has just turned into an utter lawyer's picnic. But some of the other codes and the CRIRSCO template have got some really interesting ideas in them. So we need to think about whether we want to incorporate some or all of those as well. Drifted off topic there a bit, sorry.
No, that's good, thanks. One thing I'd like to mention, Mark, before too, talked about the complaints process and people feeling that complaints weren't being dealt with. In AIG's experience, in the past 12 months, we haven't received any complaints relating to JORC, which I think's a bit different to the AusIMM's experience. And I'm actually surprised by that because tea room conversation at work can frequently be, oh, have you read this load of crap that's been put out in a release by somebody yesterday? The way that the complaints processes in both AIG and AusIMM operate regarding competent persons is pretty similar. Both organisations have a complaints committee that has the role of assessing the veracity of the complaint and determining whether it should go to whether there's a complaint to actually be dealt with, or whether it can be dealt with very, very simply by asking the competent person to correct an issue, or whether there needs to be any action taken at all. Complaints are dealt with in confidence because the complainant, the person who's the subject of the complaint deserves that. You know, it's like any legal thing. It's a case of sort of innocent until proven guilty. But the complainant would always be notified about the outcome of their complaint, and very often, and this has happened a number of times, not in the last couple of years, but in the past, the material that came out of that complaint's been used in an anonymous fashion to provide guidance to members on a particular problem. If it does go to ethics and standards and the complaint's upheld, then there's a public statement as to the outcome of the complaint, and there's almost invariably some form of sanction imposed on the member at the centre of that complaint. But for a complaint to receive any attention, it's got to be lodged formally, which is in writing. Both the AusIMM and the AIG websites have online forms that can be used to help facilitate that, or it needs to be a letter or an email to the Secretariat Office of either institute before it'll get heard. Nothing gets heard on hearsay. It's worth pointing out too that in the codes of ethics for both AIG and AusIMM, there's a requirement there of members to bring aspects of poor practice by another member or alleged poor practice by another member to the attention of the institute, and that's not happening. You know, I see that it's actually difficult sometimes to make a complaint. You know, most geoscientists working in industry are employees of a company, and the company might have a fairly dim view of somebody complaining formally about the work of somebody else in another company. But there's got to be, we need to put some thought into making sure that poor practice does get identified and go through a process, because it's not just a matter of disciplining members who are responsible for that poor practice. It's a matter of, you know, there's a lot we can learn from it that can be put out to the membership as a whole as to what could be done better, without naming and shaming anybody, and that's a valuable outcome as well that we're really not benefiting from at the moment. There's a question from Dale Sims on the Q&A about competency. You know, if
can I just make a couple of, can I just make an extra couple of comments there about that complaint stuff? Because there's a few other elements to that that we all need to be aware of. As Mark was mentioning earlier, timeliness and streamlining complaints. When you've got a bad announcement out in the market, that's affecting people who are making decisions about buying those or selling those shares. And I think often one reason why we might not be seeing as many complaints to the parents is because the complaints are happening directly to the regulator, to ASX, and ASX are able to act a lot more quickly on things than the parents can, and by engaging directly with the company and dealing with the competent person in that way. And ASX is a lot more engaged now in doing that, because as people probably realise, for the last couple of years they've employed geologists. There's 3 geologists work for the ASX now, and they have been looking at a lot more announcements before they go out. They don't look at everything. There's no way they can do that, but they are looking at a lot more stuff. They've got short lists of people who they want to pay attention to, and they have a look at their announcements. And I think they've actually been catching and preventing things that would have gone out in the past. I mean, there's still stuff comes out, no doubt about it. And that's where, as you point out, everyone's got this ethical responsibility to either get in touch with the ASX, and if you get in touch with the ASX, you should be in parallel, simultaneously talking to your parent body about the same issue. But sometimes there's not enough hours in the day, so the fastest thing is just to pick up the phone to the ASX and go, have a look at that announcement by XYZ. You might want to have a bit of a closer look at it. And I think when you search the ASX website for the word retraction and restatement and things like that, you will see that there is a bit of activity still.
Yeah. It's a fraud issue, complaints. I think a lot of the stuff that the ASX tends to pick up is what we call the sloppy presentation. It might not, in fact, be that the underlying work is in any way substandard, but within companies, then in rushing these releases out, they can mess up the disclosure statements. They can add in extra things by the MD that shouldn't be there and the like. They have to be disentangled from whether the competent person was involved in that or not. So those sorts of complaints don't necessarily go through. The other area too is that there's not great technical work, but not fundamentally flawed either, won't ever stick as a complaint, right? It's not imperfect technical work. That's quite different from deliberately misleading or deliberately omitting critical information. And so, you know, there's a lot of stuff that draws comment, you know, in the lunchroom is, you know, that's a, you know, I don't know who wrote that release, but they barely could, you know, write the English language type stuff. You know, that sort of thing can always and should always be improved, but it's not in the same league as something that's deliberately misleading. The hot potato ethical ones tend to stick. The ones where, you know, get your formatting, your spell check, and actually look at what you should be disclosing back in place. You know, they can get a coaching session out of it, but it's not at the same level. The timeliness problem that Graham raised is absolutely an issue, but I do see that a lot of the ASX ones are sort of incomplete disclosure, not actually following the formats required by JORC and the ASX, and if they don't cover well as much if the underlying work is of the appropriate standard. The other one I'd throw in there, there's a thread in complaints, which is, I know that this piece isn't right because I used to work on that project. And if that information isn't in the public domain, it can be really, really hard for those things to stick through a complaints process. So I'm aware that there were some check results on a drill program 4 years ago because I used to consult to that company. You shouldn't be presuming that the current person signing off has actually found that report, because we're excellent in our business at losing information too. So I've seen one or two like that. It's hard work. It needs to be better. And ultimately, one of the quick checks that could come out of this verification process in terms of CVs and areas of competence is that it allows for quick checks. And that also allows for people to have to put their hand up that if they're going to operate in a certain field or a certain commodity, that they pre-nominate that that's what they do. Or if they want to add it to their list, they have to add it to their formal list. And I think that would make some of them go away as well.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. There's a couple more comments on complaints on the chat, but before I get to those, Dale Sims asked the question on competency. If competency is about applying good practice, how do we reconcile competent person's professional opinion, which may or may not be good practice? We as professionals need to see the Table 1 content to be able to assess if good practice has been applied, yet as Mark points out, it isn't much use to the ordinary retail investor. Do we need parallel systems to ensure that good practice is applied? And as the gatekeepers of the code through the complaints process, should we be more active in routine peer review as JORC process QA/QC, which I guess is you have to correct me if I'm wrong, Dale, but it touches on another comment about whether there should be a committee that routinely reviews statements that are being prepared by members of the parent bodies.
Like in South Africa.
There's a readers panel in South Africa.
Oh. That's because they only have 2 announcements per year, as opposed to us who have 2 per minute.
Yeah. I think there are 2 audiences. I absolutely agree with that concept. What the ASX were trying to do last time was to get a short technical summary in the body of the release and allow the Table 1 to be the appendix. Probably that balance isn't quite right. You know, our view is that the Table 1 is useful even if a whole bunch of people don't read that bit. That a high-level summary of the key stuff should be in the high-level announcement, and perhaps they stop reading after that. maybe that's the way you cover the two audiences. It can certainly be improved on where it is now. But taking the table 1 away and just giving the high-level summary is good for the naive investor. It's no good from the professional review point of view. I do think it becomes a part A and a part B, and we were trying to avoid going the full 43-101 technical report, in which you get 350 pages of stuff to try and digest, rather than, you know, a dozen of table 1 or something. And so there's a trade-off in here. What the final answer looks like this time round, I'm not sure, but I do suspect it has to cover both audiences.
Yeah. Kim Frankham's asked the question, shouldn't the parent bodies be feeding anonymised statistics about complaint levels back to JORC and to each other? It seems a bit dysfunctional that there are complaints out there that AIG is not aware of. That happens. And it's not just between the JORC committee and the parent bodies, it's often between the parent bodies and the parent bodies of comparable codes in other countries as well.
Yes.
So there's quite a regular communication of that. The missing piece of the puzzle there, I suspect, is that we don't exchange that information with ASX at present, and that's you know, I think that's a pretty important area for improvement.
Yeah.
And there's a couple of other questions about, you know, the complaints process is too hard. Initiating a complaint doesn't need to take more than 2 minutes to quickly summarize quickly name the announcement, you know, identify the announcement and say what you think the issue is. You know, is this affected by an anti-dobbing attitude? It could well be that that's true. I think, you know, there is a cultural component to it. And another question there about confidentiality of complaints is, you know, can you stress that all complaints are dealt with in confidence? So it's not just the identity of the person who is the subject of the complaint, but it's the identity of the complainant as well. Isn't disclosed in the complaints process, and both the complainant and the subject of the complaint are provided with information about the process and outcome of that complaint. So, you know, I don't think confidentiality should be an issue. If you know, I think any member, if we as members identify work that's clearly not up to standard, then it should be called out, because even if it doesn't lead to an adverse finding through an ethics and standards process, it does contribute to, it provides input that can go into providing guidance to members.
Yeah.
That we all benefit from.
And it's important to remind everyone that the code isn't there to tell you how to do the work. It's there to tell you how to report the work. So
yeah.
It's working if you can see that there's a crap piece of work, but it doesn't tell you how to estimate a resource. It's about how to report that resource. So JORC doesn't stop you putting out any work. I mean, that's if transparency working, you can describe exactly what you've done. If you want to do a sectional polygonal with no top cut on your gold, JORC's not going to stop you doing that. It just says, tell the world that's what you've done. And then everyone can make up their own mind about it. And if you want to have, make a complaint that that's not best practice, well, that's a different matter to a public reporting code getting that information out there.
Yeah.
And this is, Steve and I were talking about it the other day, and it comes back to this question of principles and guidance, and maybe we need to pare the code right back to just the principles, but then have a layer of guidance around it that talks about the best way to do things. And that way you can capture diamonds and coal and industrial minerals and brines and in situ recovery and whatever your flavour of the month is, some funky metallurgical technique that you've just invented. But rather than having lots and lots of words in the code telling you how to talk about that, the code is really clear. And then it's almost like the CIM approach, where you've got specific documents linked to the code. You've got to have a linkage in there. It's the way ASX does things at the moment. They've got the same issue as JORC, that they don't want to go back to the finance minister every time they want to put out some new guidance. So they've got guidance notes, which they can change and update and put out whenever they want to, and their listing rules, which have to be authorised by the finance minister. If we do something similar, we only have to go back to the minister every 10 years for the code updates. But whenever we need to update specific technical guidance, we've got the liberty to do that without dragging in ASIC and ASX and every man and his dog. And I think that's probably a really important discussion to have about this next iteration of the code, and how we can deal with the necessary complexity of what we do.
So guidance notes sound, my opinion is that they're a good thing, obviously, because into the discussion earlier about the difference between sloppy reporting and non-compliant reporting, I guess there's a lot of wacky claims and interesting claims being made out there which don't contravene the code, because it does, they've followed, they've done everything you've had to say. But one man's high grade is another man's waste. And world class is subjective, and all these terms that get thrown away around left, right, and centre. Maybe guidance is a way that tightens a lot of that up. If the issue with ASIC is that punters out there who don't know anything are getting themselves in trouble by following, latest release that says world's greatest deposit now discovered with massive high grades, when the reality is they're rubbish.
Yeah, look, we've got an existing issue in the code with, what do we do with the diamond section? What's the future of the coal guidelines? And we've got all the other commodities asking for the same sort of treatment. I think the principle that Graham's just put there is that the code is the high-level principles, the high-level definitions, the commodity interpretation guidelines for that considers the next layer down, and the third layer, which would be useful, as worked examples or case studies. And if that lived in a place where we could see what good looks like, that'd be really useful too. But that sort of stops your code from going through infinite bloat, and it allows you, as Graham says, that if we need to add more commodity interpretive guidance for the code, then that comes as a guidance paper without you having to rewrite the code the whole way. Anyway, Andrew, have time? Yep.
Yeah, no, thanks, Steve. I just, in wrapping up, any final, we've covered a lot of ground in the last hour or so. Any final thoughts from anyone on the panel? Mark?
There's so much to think about. I think we've just touched the surface today.
Yeah, definitely.
Look,
all right.
There is one last thing I think it's worth mentioning. There's only a finite amount of capacity in the JORC committee members. So this time round, I think we're very seriously looking at the idea of getting subcommittees chaired by JORC committee members to help look at specific aspects. This way we can spread the load around. We can also identify people who can join the committee when I retire after this code update, and Steve. And, we've got succession planning. We've got a broader cross-section of inputs into this. The workload is spread so it happens faster. So I'd encourage AIG members to think about, are they interested in doing something? If so, let your AIG reps know that you've got an interest in this, and maybe you can have a much more material input into this exercise and help make it a faster exercise.
Yeah, it's a very good point. All right. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, everybody online for calling in and for staying the course. And to the panelists, Steve, Graham and Mark, thanks very much for your input. And I'll hand it back to you, Peter.
Thanks, Andrew. As Andrew mentioned, thanks to all the panelists and the punters out there who joined us. We'll have this video hopefully up and on the AIG YouTube channel for review at your own pace in the week or so's time. In the meantime, thanks everyone, and we'll see you in a couple of weeks for the AIG ALS technical meeting. Cheers. Good night.